how we are to relate to God. All of a sudden, if God lives on Mount Olympus, or if God is an utterly transcendent, inconceivable thing, that's one thing. What if God has bound God's self from all eternity to the lowly in the man Jesus, such that when Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor, blessed are those who mourn," he wasn't lying. But God, who is blessed, has bound God's self to those who mourn, to those who are broken, to those who hunger and thirst for what is right. All of a sudden, we're redirected in where we must seek God. We're redirected in where we must serve God. This is a rupturing of consciousness. Away from a particular imagining of God and a focusing on God where God has revealed God's self in one broken, battered Jewish body. And the consequences of this are earth-shattering. Jesus speaks parabolically time and time and time again. And yet he doesn't in Matthew 25 when he says, "I was hungry, I was thirsty, I was naked." Because he is hungry in the desert. He is thirsty on the cross. He is naked when his clothes are stripped. I was imprisoned. He is imprisoned by Pilate. Everything that Christ speaks about in the first person is expressed in the Pietà. And so Christ tells us and then shows us who God is and where God can be encountered. And in many ways, this is the scandal that Nicaea attempts to represent. And so many of the creeds around Nicaea are more formally poetic in the way that Nicaea is intended to be. If we look at the Antiochian Creed, which comes a little bit after Nicaea, it just throws words. It's breathless. You can't read it aloud without being breathless. There's no punctuation. It just goes light from light, door from door, wisdom from wisdom, truth from truth, love from love, beauty from beauty. And it just keeps on throwing these words to try and articulate this relationship. And it's beautiful, and it's good. And the Pietà, I would also suggest, is beautiful, and it's good. And it's not a different kind of thing. It's the same kind of thing. The theology certainly has a systematic and a scientific and a wonderful mode of expression. I'm not saying that we should only read Dante and not read Aquinas. Of course not. We should also not fool ourselves into thinking that Dante and Aquinas are doing two different things. And one is proper for theology in the universities, and one is fine for those freaky artists out there in their caves trying to leech money from the government. No. These are two forms of theology. Now, there are many forms of art which may or may not be theology. But there is a particular theological form of art. Even Gregory's writing. Like when I have students read Gregory of Nyssa, they struggle because he's not doing it right. He's having dialogues, and he'll have these sections where it's just metaphor after metaphor after metaphor, and I have no idea what he's doing. And Augustine will say, now, the next thing I'm going to say is rubbish, don't pay any attention to it. Then he'll talk about memory, will, and understanding. They're doing theology with a different understanding of what writing is. For example, in Gregory's dialogue with Macrina, his sister, he starts out very interestingly by talking about male and female. And there are proper male traits and attributes and forms of expression. And there are proper female traits and attributes and forms of expression. And then the dialogue weaves, and they interchange. And Gregory starts writing and expressing himself and speaking in what he has expressed to be female fashion. And Macrina will start expressing herself and speaking in a male fashion. And the whole concept of gender essentialism, the whole concept of what gender is is assailed performatively by the way Gregory's text interweaves. Could we do this today in a systematic form of theology? Yes, we could say, that gender essentialism is something which ought to be challenged. And that's a good thing to do. But to perform it, as Gregory does, is also an extremely productive thing to do. And so the Wabash grant was trying to get money to say, can students do theology in different ways? If Nicaea is an expression of theology, and so is the Pietà. If Aquinas is an expression of theology, and so is Dante. Perhaps students could be encouraged, could be unleashed to do theology in different ways. And maybe the time is right. Because one of the concluding concepts which underpinned the Wabash project was that people are doing thinking now in the electronic era, in this quote-unquote cyber era, polyphonically. What I mean by that is that if you're writing something on Facebook or on a blog, or if you're reading something on the internet, it is not simply words on a page, as it is in most academic textbooks that you will read. There will be image. There will be sound. You'll be doing things like scrolling and clicking and highlighting and interacting in a way that is unstable and shifting. The parts of your brain that read will be accompanied by the parts of your brain that hear music and see moving image and see static image and will be assailed by plural forms of light. Is it possible that younger generations are once again doing their thinking in a way which is distinct from the way in which we did thinking within the hegemony of the book, where the book is, if you like, hegemonic, is dominating, is omnipresent as the sole form of academic discourse. Do we see that? Do we think differently when we read and write online? Is it possible that we have generations that are learning to think through different media? Is it possible that if we have to do theology in the 21st century, we need to assail the hegemony of the book? Not to overthrow it. If we overthrow it, I don't have a job, so I really don't want it overthrown. I can't do any art stuff, right? But is it possible that as well as our more traditional forms of theology, that we help a generation of theologians and priests and ministers and pastors to utilize a plurality of modes of expression in their preaching, in the design of their worship spaces, in the way they select music, in the way they select image? Worship is polyphonic. It occurs within a space where there are artistic images, where there is music, where there is dance. Whether it's actually called dance or not, there's always liturgical dance. These things take place. Ought we name them and help train students, the ministers, the priests, the pastors of tomorrow, to engage them and utilize them creatively to do the kind of theological work that maybe we've forgotten how to do? My final section, because it's gibberish, I'm just going to reduce it to one or two sentences. One of the ways which we need to think about perhaps doing theology will cause us discomfort. Why is that? Because for the last few hundred years, we have refused the idea that there is a real which is accessible to all people. We've been quite happy to say that one person will perceive it thus, the other person will perceive it thus, and so therefore there is no underlying thing called beauty. The reason why you can't talk about beauty in NASCAD is because for a very long time, philosophers and theologians and scientists have overthrown the notion of beauty. It is something which is purely in the eye of the beholder. Now, I want to suggest just the idea that theology will have to challenge that. That theology does explicitly or implicitly challenge that. Theology believes that there is a thing called beauty, that the triune life is it, and that this beauty permeates all that is, and that we can relate to it, and we can enjoy it, and we can represent it. The very concept of beauty itself is something that philosophy has foreclosed upon, science in many ways has foreclosed upon. It is something that is reduced to the relativistic eye of the beholder, and theology must resist this. And I would suggest that resisting this could be, perhaps, theology's own way of contributing something back to the arts when the arts have given us, and hopefully in the future will continue to give us so much. Thank you very much. We have 10 minutes for any questions. Great. Yes, please.
The other way around.
Yeah.
What has theology given to the arts?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that there could be something said about that too.
Oh, for sure, for sure.
That would be important.
One of the prevailing assumptions was that Christian theology is plural form, and that there's lots of different forms of doing, lots of different ways of doing it, and that the arts are one of those forms, the Christian theological arts. And so I wouldn't suggest for a minute that Michelangelo is not a theologian. You were there last week or the week before, and one of the things in the Sistine Chapel, which is just incredible, is that in the centerpiece, obviously, you've got your famous Adam and God, which is an incredible theology of grace, because Adam's hand is completely limp and God's hand is reaching out. And so it's a good, solid Protestant theology of grace, that the human being is completely inactive in the salvific process. But it's not entirely that way, because we have, over the altarpiece, we have the Last Judgment, and so we have, Jesus, and everything is swirling around, it's all extremely dynamic. And you look at the face of Jesus, and you look at the face of Adam, because he's a good theologian, it's the same face. If you look at the body, Adam's body is Jesus' body. And so the human person has an active role because it's in the image and likeness of Jesus Christ. And so there's an incredibly complex theology here, which I think, in a sense, bypasses or outmaneuvers or outpaints the Protestant Catholic, if you like, opposition. And so one of the things I wouldn't like to say is that there's theology and there's the arts, and it can be helpful to say one gives to the other and the other gives back, but they're fundamentally interwoven. If we were to, in mercenary terms, we have had huge amounts of ecclesial patronage for the arts for a very, very long period of time. Christian theology in particular advances the notion that the divine is representable through the concept of divine simplicity in a way that, for example, Islamic theology more formally has resisted, and the way that some forms of Jewish theology have resisted. The idea of divine simplicity, which is, this idea is basically that that God is one, okay, and God is just the just. And so therefore justice, when we encounter it, is not ontologically not God. It is rather the presence of God, who is justice in the just things. And so therefore there is a fundamental meaning and beauty and truth to the natural order, which makes all representation potentially sacred. I feel like there's a sacramental economy, And so the Christian artist is always to